The bell tower cried once before it rang, a groaning creak like ribs breaking under weight. Then the sound spread slowly through the valley, deep and low and aching. It wasn't the kind of bell that called men to worship. It was the bell that marked a gathering, a reckoning, a remembrance of order when memory dared to fray. Beneath it, in the square etched with centuries of frost, villagers emerged from stone cottages and thatch roofs bowed by winter. Snow had fallen the night before, thin, dry, like sifted flour, and now it curled beneath cloaks and caught in bootlaces. Breath clung like ghosts to the air. No one spoke. No one needed to. They already knew who it was. Lise, hedge witch's daughter. Hands like bark, eyes prickled with the sleepless corners of other people's grief. A girl who scoured the hedgerows under moonlight, left bundles of yarrow at doorsteps, knew which root bled milk and which teased warm hope from the bellies of dying mothers. Too poor to marry, too proud to kneel, and now too dangerous to leave. Untouched by church or court, the sound came before she did, a drag, a rattle, iron scraped against stone. Two bailiffs led the procession, faces shadowed beneath boiled wool hoods, shoulders grim and unmoved. Between them came the iron cart, rusted, heavy with chains, and wood slats sticky with old black. Punishment traveled with its own sound in those days. It didn't need announcements. It echoed in the marrow. She walked behind it. No shoes, ankles bruised, hair tangled but not hidden, despite the whispered edict regarding women who defy their station. Her dress, the dull gray of unwashed morning, was too light for the February wind. Yet she didn't tremble. If she feared, she had buried it. Maybe? Under the roots where she once found foxglove in bloom too early. Maybe deeper. The pillory stood waiting. It had always been there, more permanent than any hearth, any keystone arch. Oak, anyway, blackened and cracked from years of rain and time. Smoothed by storms, sun, and bodies, it did not forgive. It did not forget. Its bolts still bore hair from the last priest's son, who'd read a French poem aloud too kindly. The charge was clear enough. Traveling the woods at night, unescorted. An unmarried woman. A torch seen where no light should be. Healing herbs found in homes where sickbeds had recovered too quickly. No one called it witchcraft. Not openly, but the word curled behind tongues like smoke that wouldn't disperse. And so the priest began to read. A parchment unfolded, Latin thick upon his breath, syllables heavy and trailing, as though incantation and penance could ever be so easily told apart. Each word another stone placed upon the girl's back. The bailiffs turned the levers. The yoke split apart with a soft hiss of wood. Lise knelt, then stood. She placed her head forward without resistance, as if she'd done all this before in a dream. Her arms followed. Then the wood closed shut. The clunk echoed, hollow and sacramental. Silence fell and stayed. The square became a place without sound, not from custom, but from shame. Only the wind moved through the space, tugging at cloaks, whispering against shuttered eyes. A mother clutched her boy tighter. A man turned back toward his grain sacks. A butcher dropped an apple and did not retrieve it. Punishment, they said, made an example. But what it truly made was discomfort. The first child dared. He approached the pillory, red-faced with fear, and tossed the apple. It hit the wood with a dull thud. No reaction from Lise. Nothing in the tightening of her jaw or the flick of her tongue. The child ran, then more. Stones at first, then insults. Foxbride, muckblood, shadow walker. Words taught not by experience, but from worn mouths, inherited suspicions, Sunday sermons too easily memorized. She did not speak, and so the silence grew around her, as heavy as any chain. By the second day, her knees had begun to bend. Someone claimed she'd murmured the name of a river goddess. Someone else said she smiled when a raven landed on the gallows crossbeam. But none swore to truth. They spoke out of hunger for myth, a thirst to make sacred their unease. And in the corner of the square, under a crusted hay awning, an old woman knelt. Her face was lined like riverbeds gone dry, and her hands shook as she picked up the discarded apple. She whispered something, a benediction, an apology, a remembering. No one noticed. The punishment had taught the village to look only at spectacle. By dusk, a storm threatened. The clouds hung low and wide over the church roof, gray with a green sick underbelly. The wind gnawed now, not whispered. A handful of villagers untied their livestock and tethered shutters. The priest passed by Lise without a glance. His torch flickered once and extinguished. There she stood, haloed by the coming dark. Her breath was thinner, her fingers purpled. But she looked forward still, eyes trained on something not quite visible. Perhaps memory, perhaps future, past the square, past the stone, somewhere further. And when the bell tower groaned once more, as if unwilling to speak of this story any further, it seemed to the youngest among them that the silence afterward had changed. It wasn't just emptiness. It was echo. She was taken down on the third day, her body limp but breathing. They gave her no hearth, no healing. She walked from the pillory as slowly as she had arrived, feet bare, mouth closed, gaze distant. But her story, though buried, remained. A year later, the old woman who had picked the apple was hanged for harboring suspicious items. A knot of dried yarrow in her shawl, a book written in her dead sister's hand. No one asked where the book had come from. Years passed. The pillory stood empty through 2 winters. Then came another name, a boy this time, a baker's son who'd stirred barley in the tithe bread. And on the morning of his shame, as they led him through the square, they found beneath the pillory a footprint pressed into frost. Small, light, nearly vanished, but it remained, just long enough to be noticed, just long enough to make them wonder who still walked the old paths, who remembers. Not all punishments leave scars where the eye can trace them. Some wear grooves into silence, others into custom. And some, like wind turned inward, carve deep into the hushed places where names are no longer spoken aloud. But the earth remembers, the wood remembers, and so do we. Let us go now to the boy with barley on his hands and bells on his ankles. Across the next village, through deeper frost, to a punishment not of blood, but of rhythm, of walking, of shame that rings across valleys, forever unfinished in sound. They heard him before they saw him, not with triumph, not with anger, but with something colder that clung to the air like ash, the tinny clang of ankle bells dragging softly across frozen earth, a rhythmless chime that echoed through the village like a forgotten prayer. He did not cry out. He did not walk with pride. He simply moved, one foot before the other, pulled by rope and judgment and a shame so dense it hung between every house along the muddy lane. He was a baker's son, 19, maybe 20, with soot under his fingernails and regret crusted behind his teeth. His crime was not theft, nor heresy, nor violence, but hunger in disguise. He had stretched the holy bread with barley, a humble grain, ground less fine than wheat, and carried in from the edges of the Lord's fields. He thought it might help, feed more mouths, serve the feast sooner. But he was not a priest, nor blessed, nor trusted to alter the sacred offerings. His punishment bore not blood, but humiliation. They tied a sheep's skull to his chest, sun-dried and yellowed, so its teeth gnashed as he walked, a grotesque mirror of his own shame. Bells were fixed to his ankles, to ring with each faltering step. So every village knew he was coming. The bread defiler, the barley boy, the silent thief of sanctity. Through 3 villages he walked, barefoot and bruised, under the eyes of mothers who turned away, and children who pointed behind their fathers' cloaks. Each stone road washing his feet in cold and disregard. At the second prayer hill, he was made to stand still as a statue while the youth recited verses about purity and obedience, their voices flat and distant. And though one child, a girl no taller than his waist, stepped forward with a piece of crust, hoping to offer mercy, her hand was struck before it could reach him, and her sobs were swallowed by the silence of the crowd. At night he wasn't given a bed, only a stable floor, where the hay was wet and the oxen spat steam beside. Him, he dreamt not of forgiveness, but of warm bread unset by ritual, loaves pressed lovingly by real hands, not blessed ones. On the 3rd day, the last village greeted him with incense not for prayer, but to mask his stench, holy scent to defend holy air, and he stood before the chapel doors that never opened. There was no sermon, no embrace for redemption, only the usher waving him back down the hill in silence. But at the final ridge, where frost clung between the bramble roots and the road narrowed like a wound closing in stone, a monk was waiting, old, bent, almost part of the hillside, who offered him a jug of rainwater and, after studying the boy's face for a long moment, as though searching for the man beneath the shame, unwrapped a parcel of honey bread from the fold of his robe. No words passed, just the action, just the blessing beyond doctrine. And then the boy walked on, into exile, not through decree, but through absence. He was not killed, not cursed, simply undone. Life would permit him to bake again, but not for the village, not for saints, only for those whose hunger still remembered his name. And though years passed, and the road grew over with moss, there were those who swore that on the coldest mornings just before sunrise, the ankle bells could still be heard faintly in the fog, like the soft tolling of sorrow-made endurance. And sometimes, if a child had fallen sick and bread appeared warm at a doorstep, no one would touch it at first. They would only watch the rising steam, remember the barley boy, and wonder how far mercy can wander before it is finally received. It began with the sound of frost cracking beneath the boot heel of the execution priest, a quiet crawl of winter waking thin, brittle, exact echoed across the cloister path as villagers clustered like drifting sheep in the nave's mouth, silent and stiff under cloaks, stiffened by years and fear. They had gathered not for blood, nor branding, nor stake fire, but for something gentler on the surface and crueler in the marrow. The sentencing of Margaretha, widow of the chapel warden, caught speaking aloud the words of the psalter over her. Hearth fire, her lips shaping verses no woman had been taught to read, let alone memorize with such savage intimacy. They'd found the book by accident, wrapped in lamb's wool beneath her son's birth-cloths, its cover cracked, pages thinned by oil, by tears, by reverent fingers that dared to touch what had once been only priest's breath, Latin sung by smoke. Rather than tongue, she didn't plead, she didn't explain. She only stood in her doorway, her hands still smelling faintly of wheat and ash, waiting for whatever came next. And what came was silence. Her punishment would not be public scourging, nor banishment, for perhaps they feared what exile might grant her, but a rite almost forgotten. Manus tacita, the quiet hands, the law unrolled like winter from a scroll, ancient and precise, iron rings forged by hand, one for each finger, connected by waxed cords to a staff of penance, heavy and polished from decades of rot. She would carry it day and night. She would speak no word beyond holy Latin, sung at midday prayer. She would dress in undyed hemp and kneel at the margin of every service. She would dwell within her own home, surrounded by the warmth she was. Forbiddens to reach, no weaving, no kneading, not even the drawing of curtains without the aid of another. Her hands, silenced by metal, became theater for the town's conscience. When she passed, the cords between the rings snapped slightly in the air, like an old marionette moving without music. Children watched in fear and awe. Women watched in pity. Men watched and quickly turned their eyes away. The staff tip tapped against cobblestone as she walked, unsteady, rhythmic, soft as a wound. Her home turned cold despite the hearth. She learned to lift water with her wrists alone. Her son struggled to dress without her calloused hands, hands that once taught him how to tie knots into nets and how to unwrap the rags around fevered wine bottles. She tried humming once, not a word, only a tune, but even that summoned stares and shushing fingers. Psalms filled the quiet like dust, sacred, distant, ritualistic. But the whispers, the living songs she had made for her children, the secret translations of kindness, those were gone now, wrapped in the rings like her blood flow, slowed and cooling. The villagers, once moved by her touch, now sprinkled salt. By their windows again. Some believed the silence would make her forget. Others hoped it would keep something sacred contained. But silence listens longer than speech. One evening, a storm tore across the plain from the north, dragging with it sheets of ice and wind too wild to pray through. Windows slammed, candles guttered, and from the dark chimney of Margaretha's cottage, smoke twisted thin and silver into the sky candle smoke, not wood fire. Inside, beneath the damp that dripped steadily from the corners of the ceiling, she sat beside her son's cot, staff propped against the stones, metal rings splayed useless beside folded hands. Before her, the Psalter lay open, not to the Gospels, not to judgment, but to a hymn of aching gratitude. Alone beneath the sound of storm and her boy's shallow breathing, her voice rose, quiet, cracked, sacred, benedict anima me domino, not in defiance, not in rage, but in devotion untouched by doctrine, her words not stolen from the monks, but reborn in her own breath. The next morning, the villagers found her porch washed clean by the rains, and on it the staff leaned oddly. Single ring had snapped free, melted smooth at the join. Of the book, no trace. Of the voice, only memory. Even the priest's clerk, tasked with weekly inspection, reported no breach, only an unusually profound silence. Days passed, then weeks, and quietly, without decree or rite, the iron rings were never used again. The staff was returned to the abbey rack, but no hand ever asked for it. Margaretha continued to walk the village, her robes undyed, her tongue silent, but a different kind of stillness clung to her now, a sanctuary, not a shutting. And sometimes, just before Vespers, a girl within the cloister would swear she heard psalms being sung in a voice too soft to echo, rising not from within a nave or apse, but from somewhere smaller, truer, where the sacred lives only when it's whispered. The punishment had bound her hands, but it hadn't silenced the word inside them. It had only driven it deeper, below the skin, into the places no law could reach. And so her silence became something else, not retreat, but ritual, not defeat, but devotion, a theology forged beneath the sound of bells. And in the hanging quiet that followed her path through snow-melt streets, girls began to sing again, not in rebellion, but as remembering. The birch trees stood motionless as prayers, their pale trunks gleaming wet with frost beneath a sky sealed in pewter, and in their silence, a procession came forth slow, deliberate, and wrapped in the breath of a watching world. They crossed the moor from the village edge without song, without banner, without clergy. At their center walked Linnea, the beekeeper's eldest, her feet bare against the cold, wet earth, her ankles cut where the brambles had kissed too eagerly in passing, her hands hidden in folds of gray wool that would not hold heat. No ropes. Found her, no guards pressed her onward. It was duty, or perhaps the weight of being known, that moved her forward. The villagers said she was cursed, not with plague nor madness, but with barrenness, a hollow cradle that had stayed a decade. Too long, a womb unvisited by Providence, despite marriage, despite fasting, despite hopeful eyes turned skyward each spring. Her husband had died of swamp fever 2 summers past, and now, with no new heir, no signs of promise, the village's fear returned to her body like rot returning to root, not a crime, but an absence. And in absence, the mind invites devils. Her sentence was an old one, dragged from the margins of ecclesial records. She would wear the cloak of endurance, a coarse linen garment stitched with binding thread and inscribed by ash, not words, but symbols, a litany of old fears. Inside it, hair clippings, nettles dried and crumbled, bone chips from saints no one could name. She would live at the hollow, a sagged shelter of birch slats and clay, unheated and wind-lashed, warm only when the candle she was permitted would take flame, which was not every night and never twice in storm. 40 nights, no fire, no music, no mirrors, only unsalted oats and the psalms in Latin, spoken aloud to empty fields. No one was to speak with her unless ordained. Silence was part of the endurance, for what she endured was not agony, but distance, the long unraveling of being seen, and then slowly sealed away. Each morning, she walked to the altar stone in the clearing, kissed it with cracked lips, and returned to sit cross-legged inside the cloak, which absorbed her body's tremble as if it too were alive. The village spoke of her in mutters now, half solemn, half afraid. Bees no longer made hives near the hovel. Birds did not nest in the birches above her roof. On the 12th night of wind, it was said she wept aloud into the plains, and the wind did not echo back. But one by one, women came never more than once, never with more than a glance. At dusk, when the light strayed thin across the meadows, they'd leave small tokens in the shadow between tree roots. Pieces of wool, broken rosaries, yellow flowers forced out by early thaw, not out of pity, out of warning. Each had known silence. In the body lost blood, cold sheets, the stillness after expected cries never came. Linnea lit candles only on the nights the rain stayed its hand, and even then the flame staggered as if unsure whether to warm or mourn. She slept beside the light, one corner of the cloak always drawn across her shoulder like armor without plate. Her hair thinned, her nails blackened at the edges, but her eyes remained alert, bright as whetstones, trained always on something. Beyond the trees, as though waiting not for a child, but for something older and more precise, understanding. By the 30th night, her body gave in as the cloak gave shape to her bones. No longer a garment, it hung around her like a pronouncement, stiff with oils and breath and suffering sealed into linen. They say on the 38th night, smoke curled gently from inside the hollow, though no wick had been lit, and a scent lingered strange, tender something like beeswax and milk. Villagers whispered, but no one dared approach. They crossed their doors and turned their faces from the forest. And on the morning of the 40th day, she emerged, alone, no cloak, no candle, her feet bare still, her arms uncovered. And while her body had shrunk in the cold, her presence had grown into silence that pressed against the lungs. She walked back to the village, not in shame nor victory, only arrival, as natural as mist returning to fields unplowed. Nothing was said. They opened no arms. She asked for no food. She passed between them, not touching anyone, and yet something within the air shifted, as though the storm itself remembered her. Behind her, others had gathered at the hollow, finding only the cloak folded atop the birch altar, its fibers stiffened. with wax but strangely warm. And circling it bees, out of season, slow, reverent. One landed on the seam where the ash, symbols had once been, and did not move until the sun crested the ridge and lit the linen with gold. To this day, they say another cloak was never made. Such punishments belonged to another age, not because laws changed, but because grief began to wear different shapes. Linnea did not speak again of what she saw. She kept bees still, taught girls which roots to soften and which leaves to burn. When she passed, it was in silence, upon a bed of wool gather and twine, a scent of early honey still clinging to her wrists. And now some say that in deep winter, when fog hugs the forest's brow and trees stand like solemn witnesses, a faint sweetness lingers in the path toward the hollow. Tiny footprints press into the frost, and bees, impossibly, return. It was snow that told the tale first, thick, soundless, unnatural for mid-autumn, blanketing the castle road the same morning the stallion was brought from its stables in ceremonial gear, its breath rising like smoke beside the silent grooms. The village below stirred in fragments, pulled from dreams not by alarm, but by that strange hush that precedes shame, when the world seems to dim its color out of anticipation. The court had not rung its bell that morning. No herald called the people forth, and yet they gathered, bare-handed and raw-faced, around the gates where justice wore its mask, not of flame or iron, but silk and laughter. Across the wind-laced courtyard stepped the disgraced knight, Sir Cedric of Halden March, once the favored retainer of the high-born house, now stripped of title and dignity, clothed not in armor, but in a woman's gown, woolen, poorly dyed, coarsely spun, and stitched with mocking roses that bled scarlet thread against the snow. Around his neck hung a broken sword, snapped clean at the guard and looped crudely with twine, a relic not of violence but of dishonor. And upon his head, instead of helm or hood, they placed a bridal veil, sewn from silver lace once meant for the baron's daughter. His crime, his ruin, a whispered betrothal, a stolen letter, a promise made in the wrong corridor, beneath the wrong moon. Some say she loved him. Others said he used her name like a key. Either way, she now bore the shame quietly from behind stone walls. And he bore it upon a saddle blistered by frozen wind. The stallion's flank shimmered beneath its barding, golden bells tied along the hem of embroidered drapery, each one trembling with a music no soul dared dance to. Up he mounted, unguided. No hands helped him. His boots had been taken from him, and his feet, already blue at the edge of nail, curled around the stirrups as he found position upright, unbroken, but unraveling slowly before a crowd that dared not meet his eye. The procession moved not quickly nor grandly, but with the slow, deliberate mockery of a ceremony meant to be remembered with discomfort. Children stood silent, unsure whether to laugh or look away. The old women spat, but not at him, rather at the moment itself, as if it had curdled something already sick in the corner of time. Down the central road he rode, past the fountain that hadn't thawed in 3 days, past the baker with no bread left warm enough to sell, past the girl who once sang to him from the hallway before vespers. What he saw in their faces was not rage, but the slow erosion of belonging. That look a man carries when the land he once fought for no longer wants to claim his bones. At the far end of the road waited the place of dismount, nothing grand. No platform, just 3 worn steps beside the old well, where judgments ended before rope was needed. There he slid down, feet crunching into ice, the veil sticking slightly to the dried blood at his lip. In silence, he approached the stone basin, bent and washed his hands with salt scooped from the well's edge. The crowd still gathered, gave no cry, no cheer, no call. This was not sport. This was memory sentencing itself to quiet. Then he walked, slowly, not stumbling, though the bells still clanged weakly with each step, toward the tree line where the banished once made their camp, drowned in mist and silence, where the fog was thick enough to forgive. Behind him, the stallion was led away, its bells muffled with gray cloth. The dress was discarded at the village edge, draped over a boundary stone where it hung for weeks, battered by wind and rain, until only the red thread remained, fraying like a nerve. They say he lived on the outer ridge for a while, near the split birch where owls nest but never call. He learned to trap, to start small fires with dried moss and bone. Sometimes a young boy would come near and find woven cord left behind, scraps of bridle leather shaped into rings. Other times, nothing but hoof prints in places no horse walked in years. The villagers never said his name again, not out of hate, but out of superstition, the way you might not name the storm that took your best roof, or the fever that left one bed forever smaller. But late at night, when the wind blew just right, between stones and shutter, the bells would sometimes be heard again, faint, scattered, almost questioning, not as if riding, but as if remembering how to be still. The marsh didn't speak in words, but it whispered in rot, a low, sucking murmur beneath the reeds, beneath the fog, beneath the memory of all things buried with their names torn off. There, in the liminal lands where the village's edge met the rise of water and doubt, a punishment long asleep had awakened, pulled from the silt like a corpse in thaw. The dunking frame, old, wooden, iron-fanged at its edges, green-veined with moss and barnacled with age, was dragged from the back of the chapel barn early that morning, its emergence signaled not by bells, but by the shifting of birds. Away from the sky above the fen, they wiped away the mildew with vinegar-soaked cloth, tightened the rusted hinges, tested the hoisting arms between grunts and prayer, and said nothing. The villagers knew. They always knew. The charge was soft in the mouth, but sharp in consequence. Elfreda, a widow from the North Stream, accused of muttering charms over spoiled milk and fallow seed, of knowing which herbs to burn and which, names not to speak, of surviving her husband's cough when stronger bodies had already failed. She had said little at her hearing. Perhaps she laughed, perhaps she wept. Accounts shifted with the weather, but by sunrise she stood at the edge of the causeway, hair knotted with river grass, wrists bound in leather thongs, eyes focused not on the crowd that gathered, but on the water that waited like a beast just woken. The frame creaked as they laid her across it, lowered by rope and manhood, the entire contraption groaning with ancestral purpose. That first plunge broke the sky, her body disappearing beneath the muck-brown surface, scapular pressed against sand, lungs filling with ancient silence. She surfaced slower than expected. Her face was expressionless, her mouth unmoved. She did not scream. The second time, the frame juddered loose at the join, as if the marsh herself resisted, and when Elfreda emerged again, a strand of weed clung to her cheek like a lover's hand. No one dared speak. The priest crossed himself with a hand that trembled too openly. By the third plunge, children started crying, not from fear of her, but from the strangeness of the air, how heavy it had become, how old. Some claimed the reeds bent toward her. Others whispered of birds circling lower than they ought, but none left. And so the fourth, fifth, sixth descents passed in ritual time, and each time she returned wet, slow, unreadable, the memory of mercy grew thinner. On the seventh plunge, she did not rise as quickly. The marsh held her longer than it should have. The ropes slackened. One breath passed, then another, then there. Her hand breached the water first, slow, sure. Not as pleading, but as pointing. The crowd stepped back. A hush swam through them, thick as fog, and where her breath broke the surface, it released not a gasp, but a steam, unnatural, warm, rising in coils over the water. She was lifted from the frame and laid beside the path. No physician was summoned. No cloth warmed her. She lay on her side, eyes half closed, lips moving faintly, but no sound passed between them. They left her there until night. By the following morning, she was gone. No footprints in the mud. No disturbance beyond the cluster of frogs seated in a ring where her body had lain. They sent a search party through the rushes, checking every hut, every thicket, but nothing. Only a ring of worn willow branches braided beside the chapel door in the shape of a sleeping eye. The dunking frame was pushed back into the barn without ceremony, and the locks were replaced not out of ritual, but fear. Children were warmed. From the water's edge, fishermen spat before casting nets. The marsh, they said, had taken her, or spared her, or claimed her. But no one spoke her name again, not next to open flame, not beneath the bell tower. And yet, during the harvest nights, when mist rolled in too early and the oxen refused their yoke, villagers swore they heard a soft dripping, not rain, not dew, but as if something had just surfaced, just now, just near. And in that sound, they remembered a woman who had been submerged 7 times, and who returned not with curses, but with quiet. A quiet deep enough to make fear kneel. The chant had no beginning. It swelled beneath the chapel stones like mist, within sealed crypts, humming low against mortar that bled with time. And in that soundless sound, they led Brother Emmerich downward, robes frayed, tonsure undone, hands trembling not from fear, but from something more relentless, knowledge. His guilt was not carved in flesh, but in ink the wrong books read, the wrong cures spoken, the wrong stars named by breath rather than benediction. He had read of Saturn's bones, copied a healer's notes on root and flame, studied skies. Beyond permitted comets, and somewhere between the bindings and the silence, faith bruised into heresy. They did not burn him. That would be too loud. Instead, they lowered him into the hollow cloister beneath St. Albert's Abbey, a reliquary long abandoned, damp with centuries, its rafters webbed with breathless dust and bats that screamed, like voiceless angels. It was a cloister in name, only a cell beyond Scripture, carved of wet stone slick with candle drippings, cold as betrayal, empty but for a bench, a jug, and one single candle given new each week. He would live there alone, forever. No voice but the psalms at prime, no mirror, no change of cloth, no sky. Just the daily crust passed through a slot, water from a cracked cistern, psalters for hands that once turned pages of stars. Above him, Mass continued, bells rang, mains were spoken. But down below, Emmerich prayed with lips blistered from damp, and mapped constellations in the dirt with the corner of a nail, tracing Orion not to predict war or harvest, but simply to remember that time still moved. The candle became his clock, the wax pooling like melted flesh at the foot of the Virgin icon painted on decaying plaster. When he cried, it came out in song, a blend of Latin and wind. And though they never visited him again, beyond the grain-bearer, some monks passed the nave slowly at night, pausing above a square of stone where the chanting never quite stopped. They said it was madness, that he sang to keep time from eating him. But one winter evening, a pilgrim stumbled into the abbey during a snowfall, claiming she'd heard voices beneath the chapel floor, voices not bound by breath, but by memory. Emmerich lived 27 years beneath the abbey, died with his hands folded over a candle stub, its wick unlit but shielded gently, like a final word never spoken aloud. Now, on the longest nights of the year, when the bells cease and the cloisters fill with cold, a thin light sometimes leaks beneath the altar, not gold, not fire, but something else, as though a candle still burns for stars too far to name. The veil was not white, Though it caught the light like bone, it was silver-threaded linen, soaked with rose water and relics of sight, stitched by hands that feared what the eye could see when not governed by altar or crown, and when they placed it upon Anella's head, the hush it summoned was deeper than sermon. The midsummer heat had swollen the stones of the castle square, air filled with wilted rosemary, and sweat from horses too long kept still. Yet the people gathered, drawn not by war drums or executions, but curiosity edged with awe the punishment. Of a noble girl who claimed Saint Agnes had spoken to her in firelit dreams, and filled her with visions of lambs, crowned in flames and altars, bleeding red without blade. Her words were too vivid, her voice too clear, and truth, when sung from a mouth without title or vow, can feel like fire against vellum. They called her a false mystic, a vision crafter, accused not of witchery, but of pride dressed in piety. The sentence was a public veiling. 40 days, no speech, no touch, no eye contact. Wrapped in a garment cut for spectacle, she was to walk each daylight hour robed and unseen, neither cloistered nor freed, drifting between chapel and market, part of the world and exiled from it. The veil hung to her breastbone, brushed the corners of her cheeks, blurred her face beneath shifting silk that glimmered like mercury vision obscuring vision. She passed through crowds like a ghost, half respected, half feared. Children stopped their play. Vendors whispered blessings and curses in tandem. Even the clergy gazed downward when she knelt beside them in pews, her prayers silent, her presence unsettling in its quiet boldness. Some said she wept beneath the veil, others that she smiled. None could know. Her voice sealed beneath linen, hummed like a psalm trapped in a locked reliquary felt, not heard. On the 29th day, a storm rolled in from the east and broke over the court with feverish speed, tearing down banners and silencing carillons. Anella stood beneath it, unmoving, veil soaked through, clinging to the slope of her nose, the dip of her lips, so that for the first time her face flickered beneath the fabric, and the wind seemed to hush to see it. On the 40th morning, they came with ceremony, heavy-handed, torch-lit, to remove the veil and pronounce her purged. But she was not in her quarters. They found the garment folded with precision atop the chapel's threshold, weighted with a single blood-red rose that should not have bloomed until autumn, its scent swarming the air like incense from a cracked thurible. She had left no passage, no tracks in the dust, not even hushed goodbye. Only the veil, only the flower. And something shifted in the town after that. The bishop's sermons grew gentler. The tapestries in the scriptorium began depicting saints who walked alone, faces blurred oddly at the edges, as though half-veiled in devotion. Years passed, and still some claimed to see her, a veiled figure beside gravestones during tempest, eyes flashing silver beneath lightning, unmoving and unreachable. It said that once during feast season, a blind child touched her hand in the crowd, unaware, and later described warmth, like sun through linen, and the voice of a lamb singing. Just beyond hearing. No one punished vision after that. They only whispered it. And occasionally, on feast days long after her name had been struck from record, girls would cradle rose petals in their palms and step beneath cathedral arches with their eyes closed, not out of shame, but in homage, to see what cannot be seen, to belong where one is not welcomed, to wear the veil not in silence, but as memory. The wind in the highlands did not howl, it moaned, low and long like a deep wound waiting to speak, threading through the crags and heather with a voice older than the kingdoms themselves. And in that wind, alone among the quiet bones of stone and thorn, knelt Sibylla of Glenmarch. There were no walls, no torches, no court to witness her punishment. Only sky, only frost, only the steady heartbeat of the moor beneath her knees. She had refused a betrothal, and not to a pauper, but a land-holding elder 3 decades her senior. whose fingers cracked like salted wood, and whose breath bore the scent of death sweetened with wine. Instead, she'd chosen a shepherd young, poor, a maker of flutes, and incapable of offering more than love. Her refusal had not angered the priest, nor even the groom, who merely shrugged, but it stirred something deeper in the elders: fear. What spread faster than sin was example, and a girl who said no with her back unbent became a threat. They sentenced her to the kneeling vigil, 40 days upon the stone of supplication, a broken slab atop a wind-beaten ridge, ancient as the roots of the earth, worn smooth not by water, but flesh and penance. She would kneel from sunrise to moonrise, clothed in coarse blue wool, with no covering for her head, and a silence absolute save for let-in muttered at dusk. Any food she ate, she had to gather herself. Any warmth won only by prayer. She built no fire, had no visitors, save the birds who lined the cairns without song, and the occasional woman who approached the path with downcast eyes and left herbs wrapped in linen where snow did not hold. Her knees began to bleed by the 3rd day. The wind pressed her spine like weight, but she remained, not just out of duty, but something quite a resistance as steady as breathing. She did not weep. She did not sing. She endured. The villagers avoided the ridge, but watched from afar. Heads bowed when they caught her shape against the skyline, a sliver of blue carved into snowlight. On the 19th day, frost gathered at her hairline like a novice's crown, and when a deer passed inches from her unmoving frame, it did not startle. It bowed. She was becoming something else. Not pardon. Not broken. Just elemental. The stone beneath her by then was warmed, not enough to melt ice, but enough to remember her. Imprint. By the 40th morning, when she finally rose, the birches bent inward like chapel rafters, and she placed upon the stone her wooden bowl, empty as if offering all she'd withheld. She walked back through the valley in silence. No declaration. No return to love. No banners. She simply re-entered the world, changed. Some said the shepherd had waited, others that he married a merchant's daughter. But Sibylla spoke of neither. She taught weaving, grew roots, whispered prayers none could translate. And the stone remained. Seasons passed, moss grew, snow returned. And still, girls climbed the hill in secret, some to kneel, others simply to touch and listen, their palms tracing the groove worn wide by one woman's will. And now, deep into storm season, when sky cracks but rain will not fall, there are those who say they see her still kneeling with her eyes closed above the village, unclaimed spirit wrapped in blue, waiting not for forgiveness, but for the land to remember that not all vows sanctify, and not all silence submits. It began with honey pure, golden, stolen in a moment of hunger or awe. No one could decide, and ended with bells, the kind that cry without joy, stretched between rooftops and smoky sky. The boy had not meant treason. He had served in the castle kitchens since his hands could carry clay jars, his fingers stained with flour and fig stems, his head bowed before every passing boot. On the morning of the earl's daughter's wedding, while nobles sang litanies of lineage and platters were arranged like battlefields of glistening wealth, the boy had dipped one finger, just one, into a jar of saffron honey meant for the yow. Bride's feast, and tasted it. Some said he licked it off with closed eyes. Some said he wept. But to take sweetness from a noble tongue was a theft far deeper than hunger. The punishment, too, was refined. Not flaying, not the pyre. That would pass too quickly. Instead, they took his words. This ritual had no name, only memory, the mute Bellringer's charge. They tied his tongue with waxed cloth soaked in vinegar and bound him to the monastic tower of St. Rurik's, a place colder than the outer walls, where pigeons slept in rafters and soot fell like slow confession. There he would live, not exiled, not condemned, simply silenced. Every morning he would summon the day with rope-burned hands, pulling the great bell that had once announced coronations and deaths alike. His footfalls echoed up 70 spiral steps, carved in stone too narrow for rest. He rang the bells not with joy, but as breathing as endurance. The rope was rough and gray, damp with rain and blood when pulled too sharply. Tolls were measured in grief, not time. Down in the valley, they marked hours by the sorrow in the sound, uneven, drawn long like threads unraveling in air. The tone itself seemed to say, almost and never arrived. That was his punishment, to summon others without ever being. Summoned to call to feasts and prayers he was forbidden to taste. One Michaelmas morning, years on, the nursemaid of the very bride he had stolen the honey for left a parcel near the tower's base. Honey bread crumbled in cloth, a sprig of rosemary tucked beside it. He did not come down to take it. But that night the bells rang differently, frail at first, then rising, then strange like a song, remembered from inside sorrow. No one spoke of it, no one dared ask who tuned the ropes. They only listened. Seasons changed. The boy became a shape glimpsed in fog, perched in the tower's high arch like a bird who forgot it had wings. And though he would never again speak, the tower began to respond to the valley's grief, as if some part of him had stitched pain into the mechanics of sound. When the Lord's Son died in spring plague, the bells rang for 3 days straight, not by order, not by right, just in mourning, just in knowing. They say when he finally died quietly, hand curled still around the cord, the bell rang once more on its own, with no breath to guide it. And in the stillness that followed, the village heard something they had forgotten. Peace not declared, but felt. A kind of silence that forgives. His name, never widely known, melted into the cold stone of the tower. But during storms, or births or quiet deaths, the bells still speak not in language, but in something close, something true, as if carried through the rope, through the wax, through a boy who once dared taste joy before it was permitted.